What's up guys, my name is Josh and today we're going to be talking about the M1060C from Monoprice. We're also going to be comparing it against the VERUM ones, the Sundaras, the standard M1060s, and the LCD2Cs, and we'll talk about all those in a minute. Now before we get started, I want to send a huge thank you to Israel who's this headphone belongs to him, and I want to thank him and the rest of the patrons for sending stuff out and supporting the channel. For now, a little brief introduction onto the M1060C. So I'm actually using a mod from a company called Armatan, A-R-M-A-T-T-A-N Productions. And I'm not using any foam on it because none of the felt or the stock foam that actually comes in the M1060C stock I felt like sounded better than completely open. There's already a dust cover for the actual driver itself. So if you want to get a result exactly similar to this, you can just take the grills off and you're going to basically have the exact same sounding headphone that I have. And I don't want to deal with extra foam because that's going to change the sound signature. So just know I've talked to a few people who have put in different types of foam in there and you can get obviously various results. So you may want to experiment with that on your own. I'm just going to be reviewing it without the foam, with the dust cover. Now a little bit more, I'm not quite sure why they chose to make this a closed back headphone. I mean, it's a pretty good closed back headphone. You know, it's not the most spectacular thing in the world, but it's pretty decent for the cost. But this is a killer open back headphone. They're one of the best, not only planars, but they're one of the best headphones under $500 in my opinion. And then over $500, you start to see a little bit nicer things like better instrument representation, wider sound staging. You start to see a little bit of benefits here and a little bit of benefits there with headphones over $500. And it doesn't compete with all headphones over $500, just one in particular. But like I said, we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so the treble response on the open back version as opposed to the closed back, I felt like the closed back was pretty dead and lifeless. I mean, it was detailed and the treble was all there, but it just kind of sat kind of as this underlying, these underlying notes and wasn't really all that impressive. Now, the open back version has kind of made that a little bit more lively and energetic. Now it's still giving me pretty even performance by ear, but it's just brought up a lot more and it's a little bit more sparkly and shiny compared to the closed back variant. Now that being said, it's not, it's still not a bright headphone or a super, treble intense headphone. The headphone reminds me a lot of the LCD2C if you have tried that, to where you get this great mid-range performance, you get this amazing bass performance, but the treble, while detailed and definitely part of the music, it just isn't brought up in terms of volume. And so to compare it for just a second, we'll get back to the actual comparisons. Against the Sundara is a much more treble intensive headphone. This is a much cleaner, more analytical headphone in the treble regions compared to the open back M1060C. All right, so mid-range. Now, while the closed back variant I felt like was okay for vocals, it didn't really stand out in a particularly poor or particularly good way. But the open back version really, it's really good. The vocal performance coming out of here is incredibly thick, very intense, very impactful, very forward. Not quite as isolated as something like I don't know, like a HD6XX, for example. That's going to kind of give you like a pinpoint, vocal performance. This is more broad, but it's bigger. It's coming at you in like a more intense and visceral way. Bass response. This is something that I was a little bit worried about, because when you have a closed back headphone, it's very easy to kind of trap bass in a closed back headphone and produce a lot more bass sound with a closed back headphone. But opening this up, I mean, it's very strong bass performance. And I mean, considering that it's a $320 headphone, it's very clean bass performance as well. It is actually more intense than the VERUMs, more intense than the M1060s, more intense than the LCD2Cs, and more intense than the Sundaras. I'm trying to think of a $500 headphone that hits harder than this does in the bass response, and I'm kind of hard pressed to find one. Now I do try not to hype things too much, and I don't want to tell you that this is the perfect bass performing headphone, because it's certainly not. But it is very, very good. You're getting an incredibly meaty, impactful, just super energetic, pretty dynamic, just overall like solid bass performance. I mean, I have zero complaints in terms of the bass. It's not bloated, it's not bloomy. Now, the one downside to the bass I would say is that it's, perhaps not everybody's going to like the delivery. It's very in your face. This headphone overall, even the open back version, which I thought was going to kind of spread things out a little bit, and it really doesn't. And that's one of the downsides to the headphone is imaging and soundstage, but we'll get to that in a sec. But the delivery of everything is just immediate and, you know, just it's right there. Like it's just very, very present in all the categories. And it actually reminds me, I mean, it doesn't sound totally like, but it kind of reminds me of the LCDX and the LCD4 to where, you know, it's just there. Like it's just right up in your face and you're not going to escape it. Now I'm not, I'm not saying it sounds like an LCDX or an LCD4. It's just to where there's no like openness or breathability to the sound. Now, speaking of that imaging and soundstage, imaging is good on this headphone. It's pretty good. It can do instrumental separation fairly well. What this headphone is not good at though, and almost every headphone that we're going to compare against it, is sound staging. It does not soundstage very wide at all. And I thought, you know, in the closed back version, you get a pretty good, I mean, it opens up a little bit, but that's about as wide as this headphone really gets. So it seems more of a driver limitation than an actual enclosure limitation, because it's not very wide. Total width would be comparable to maybe 6XXs or 5.8Xs. Like it's just not a very wide headphone. And that is one of the downsides and one of the things that all the other headphones do beat it at. Even though that's one of only a few things that actually beats it at. All right, so let's jump into some comparisons here. And first, I guess we'll start with the stock M1060. And I guess this is a good time to bring this up, but I'm not sure what Monoprice is thinking making the M1060C a closed headphone. I think it should have been a revision 2, like an M2060 or an M1060. You know, I know this is the one I have here is actually revision 2 of the M1060. But honestly, I think Monoprice could have had a gold mine if they had like a little hybrid kit for this thing where you know, they provided some grills that fit this, because the grill sizes are a little bit different, by the way. Where they provided grills that fit the M1060C that you can make it either open or closed depending on what you want. Because I was talking to one of the friends of the shows, and there's no way that Monoprice didn't test the M1060C as an open headphone, like without the cups. So they had to have some reason to chase after the closed market, and perhaps it's just because it's less saturated, so it's easier to stand out, and maybe in that case they succeeded. But they still could have tackled that market with the hybrid system or providing both. And you know, what does an extra grill cost? I mean, they could charge $5-10 extra for just a couple of screws and you know, a small piece of foam and a Monoprice grill to slap on there, and they would have had an awesome headphone. And then the other possibility is maybe they have contractual obligations to manufacture a certain amount of M1060s, and so they don't want to interrupt the sales of the M1060s. That's one possibility. Now for the comparison here, in almost every category, the M1060C Open is a better headphone, except for a couple things which could be very important. Sound staging is going to be one of them. The 1060 is a much wider headphone than the C. And that is going to be a huge caveat. Some people love soundstage and some people don't give a shit. If you really like soundstage and you're willing to sacrifice almost every other category, the M1060 is going to be the better option for you. If you like just rock solid bass performance, more focused, in my opinion, better, you know, more even vocal presence, the C is going to be your cup of tea. Now, regarding the treble, this is a little bit of a toss-up. Not everybody's going to care again. So the M1060 has a little bit of issues with 5K ringing, but the M1060C is a completely different driver. It doesn't have that issue at all. Like it's not even the same thing. But the M1060 is going to have more active treble response. Now it's going to be a little bit more uneven, but it is going to be a bit more lively in the treble response. And honestly, I kind of like the treble response. Now, it does kind of have this metallic tone to it, so it's not being as neutral as the C is. Not that the C is a neutral headphone, but you get what I'm saying. But if I'm not searching for that neutrality, I actually do like the treble response on here, actually a little bit more, but I totally recognize that this is a superior headphone in terms of technicality of treble response. So it's going to be a little bit of a toss up in that area, but overall, the C is just a better headphone. You don't have to deal with the wood cups. It's just, what is it, 20, 30, 40, 50 extra dollars for this headphone, and you're getting just an absolute beast. Okay, so the next comparison, which is going to be the Sundara. And I actually like this comparison because these are very different headphones. You've got heavy, bulky, and uncomfortable, meaty sound, and, you know, thinner, lighter, faster on this side. And depending on who you are and what you like, you are really going to, I think, prefer the Sundara, or you're really going to prefer the M1060. And because they're not directly head to head, I can, at least separate the audiences a little bit better. So the categories that the Sundara takes ahead are cleanliness of sound, clarity of the sound environment, instrumental separation, treble performance is superior, the speed is superior on the Sundara, the room between the instruments is far more clear on the Sundara. The sound staging is better, but the Sundara out of the box, for a planar at least, is actually a little bit thin sounding. It doesn't have like the most, emphasized bass response. Now, last thing regarding the vocals is that, when you put this on, the vocals come across very clear, and these actually sound like a hair muffled in comparison. But for me, after about 2, 3, 4 minutes, that muffle kind of starts to recess, and you sort of kind of acclimate to the sound, and you end up with a richer, fuller, thicker sound on the M1060C. So depending on if you like kind of clean and crisp, I would go with the Sundara. If you like, warm, bassy, mid-range focused, I would go with the M1060C. Okay, so now the VERUM ones, and I won't spend too much time on this because I haven't done the full review yet, so it's really hard to have context to what I've already said. But the biggest differences between the VERUM is that the VERUM has kind of less impactful mid-range and certainly less impactful bass performance compared to the C here. Now the VERUM does have significantly wider and more natural sounding soundstage compared to the 1060C. And just to give you an example regarding the imaging and soundstage, it's much more comparable to the standard M1060 for that category. Now where the VERUM falls a little bit behind is kind of visceral impact and punch that the M1060C has. The VERUM kind of has a wider scope of the music, whereas the M1060C is just kind of like visceral, impactful, and intense. All right, boys, here it is. So the LCD2C. And I think I've earned a little bit of credit in the audio community, I would hope, because I have been very, very strict about not kind of overhyping certain headphones or, telling you that such and such headphone is oh so good and it competes with $1,000 headphones or whatever. I really try and bring a tempered, even-headed, kind of opinion to the discussion of headphones. While this is an $800 headphone, and it is a better headphone than the M1060C for a couple of reasons, and we'll talk about that, these two headphones are actually very comparable. And I'm not saying that the M1060C is comparable to all $800 headphones, because not all $800 headphones are, equal. But the sound signature that's offered by this is really, really, really close to the 2C. Most of the similarities actually revolve around the delivery of the sound. The LCD2C compared to other $800 headphones kind of has a relatively one-dimensional sound characteristic. I mean, it soundstages a little bit, and it's got, a little bit of focus in the vocal presence, but it's not nearly as wide as like a K712 or a DT1990, or some of the Hyphemans, or really the Alex. Anything around that $500 to $1,000 price tag, there are other headphones that will soundstage quite a bit wider than this will. Now on top of that delivery, regarding their frequency range that they tend to push forward or recess, they're also very similar. So these both have slightly recessed treble performance. It's not the most active treble in the world, which is going to be great for certain people, especially those of you who are treble sensitive like I am. They're both going to give you incredibly warm mid-range performance, very focused, very forward, very large, in-your-face type of vocals. The bass response on both is incredible, but actually goes to the M1060C for impact and visceralness. Now, if you're somebody who thought that the LCD2C was too bassy, the M1060, the way I would describe the bass difference is that the M1060 is going to have more immediate impact, more immediate slam, and is going to hit harder at a lower frequency than the than the LCD2C is. But I'm not giving the win to the M1060 because of the amount. I'm giving it to it because of really the cleanliness while maintaining that amount. The bass performance on the 2C is, in my opinion, very, very good. It's not to be scoffed at in any capacity. But when comparing these two, the 1060 has a more transparent bass response. It's more see-through. And regarding bassy headphones, that's really what I like to see. I like to see a headphone that has a lot of bass but isn't ruled, or the sound isn't determined by whatever the bass is doing. Now, the other categories is that the 2C is actually going to have a little bit smoother treble performance compared to the slightly more active, more alive sound of the 1060C. And that's going to have approximately the same speed and delivery to my ear, relatively close. And now the 2C is going to be a little bit wider in terms of soundstage, although like we already discussed, neither headphone is particularly wide to begin with. And then the obvious thing that I have to give to the 2C is the build quality and the comfort. It's just such a, when I put this on, it feels like a hug on my head. Like I really, really enjoy the kind of fit and feel. And it's a little bit heavy, but so is the 1060C, but mostly the distribution of the weight of the headband and kind of the clamp force of the ear cups makes for a very comfortable listening experience. Whereas the 1060C, you kind of get a hot spot on the top of your head right away, right here. And then you don't really get that hug feeling, and it feels kind of loose. And the build quality just isn't up to par. Granted, we're talking about a $300-ish headphone versus an $800 headphone, so there's going to be some caveats. But in terms of sound quality, what really impressed me the most was how similar they are. Now, I think as an overall package, the 2C is actually a little bit more even and is honestly, it's the superior headphone here. But depending on what you like, the 1060C might be worth checking out. All right, so I guess this leads me into my conclusion about the open back version of the M1060C. This is a headphone that hits legitimately above its price tag. All the way up to $500, it's one of the best options for not just a planar headphone, but for a headphone under $500. It's very impressive. Now, there are a couple things, it doesn't soundstage. It doesn't have a good build quality. I mean, it's metal, but it's just, feels kind of flimsy and it's not very comfortable. Now, there's a mod that I did have, but I shipped it back to the owner, and I don't know what I was thinking before I filmed it, but there's like these knit headband wraps that you can put around this, and it actually makes it a lot more comfortable. And I'll put a link down below where you can check that out. And it'll actually fit a lot of different headphones, not just the M1060. Now, overall, it's a really impressive headphone. Now, people are claiming that it's like endgame, god tier material. I don't think so. I think it still has a lot of weight. Like if it sounded the way it does with crazy wide soundstage, then I'd probably be a little bit more likely. But because it's really missing that category, I just, it's not really an end game headphone for me, but I mean, $320, it's a flipping good deal. All right, guys, I think that's gonna wrap it up. Thank you to the patrons. Thank you, Israel, for sending this out. There are Amazon affiliate links. Those do help support my channel if you choose to purchase anything, but of course that hasn't affected my decision. I think that's gonna wrap it up, guys. Thanks very much for watching. My name is Josh, signing off.